Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Rising Tide Talk. I am Clay Powell, co-founder and lead designer at Nat2 Press, but you may also recognize me from a talk that I did here as a guest discussing selling in person, replacing Matt, who had some things come up that he had to get to, but that is all good. I'm filling in today to talk about one-page TTRPGs. For such small packages, they carry a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it with René-Pier. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, so I'm RP. If you want to practice your French, you can try to say René-Pierre. I'm a French-Canadian TTRPG designer. Many may know me as Fari RPGs. That's me, that's my publishing brand. So yeah, I've been a TTRPG designer for a couple of years now, and I've published games that you may know about, such as Breathless, which is a one-page RPG, or Firelights, another one-page RPG, and others such as Stoneburner, which we crowdfunded a year and a half ago, if I recall. But yeah, I'm a big fan of one-page RPGs. This is essentially how I got started into this business, and yeah, very, very excited to come and talk about this today.
Awesome. Yeah, a handful of RPGs you might recognize. Waste Walkers. I believe you're working on Dungeon Bound right now, which I saw was a Souls-like. There's more words after Souls-like, but that's usually enough to get me to check it out personally. And actually, I got to play Stoneburner quite some time ago. I don't remember if it was before or after crowdfunding, but it was a little AP, and that was very fun. So I can vouch a little bit for the game design. Before we get into how we're going to frame the questions today, I did want to say I personally find it easier to pay attention to these sorts of talks when we establish a bit of credibility. Obviously, you are someone worth listening to when it comes to one-page RPGs, but in short, could you explain why you think you are someone worth listening to on the subject?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of like what I've done, like if we're talking in terms of like credibility, like my games have been downloaded on itch tens of thousands of times. The Stoneburner Kickstarter did almost $45,000. With the backer pre-orders, it was closer to like $70,000. So like, and this was essentially almost a solo project apart from like a couple of like guest writers and like hiring an editor and an artist. So I love TTRPGs. This is essentially what I do when I'm not at my day job or when I'm not with my family. And yeah, also in terms of like what I've done, I'm also a big fan of open license content. So the games that I make often come with an open license, and which that allows people to not just get the game and like read it for free, but also to copy and paste it and adapt it and publish it and monetize their third party content. So I have made system reference documents for things like Breathless, Firelight, Songs and Sagas, and of course, like Dungeon Bound also will get an open license. And through those open licenses, there's been more than 450 games that have been published using rules that I have designed.
Wow, that must feel really cool to have that many people want to play with the toys that you made like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to build my cred, but also while I'm saying this, I'm like, this is unreal.
Oh, exactly. I mean, hey, that's always good to hear. And then anyone who's confident enough to kind of open up the heart of what they've made and let other people monkey around with it, I think that speaks confidence to what you've made already. And then the fact that people say, yes, I would like to do that is even better. So I think that is perfectly reasonable enough to tune in now actively. To go over how we're going to talk today, we're going to be framing questions through three lenses. The first is going to be the game design and philosophy behind creating one-page RPGs. Next, I want to talk about the practical considerations of a single page, visual design, layout, info hierarchy, and their place even within the economy of tabletop. And then the last thing we're going to touch on is advice for creatives of all types who want to try out one-pagers or maybe just level up their existing one-page design, including guest questions. Let's go ahead and move into some of my initial questions. To start off, what do you like about designing a one-page RPG?
It'll sound weird, but one thing that I like is that it prevents scope creep. Two things. I'll try to tackle this question from two angles. The first one is like it prevents scope creep. Like when I create something and I'm thinking this is going to be one page, this is often going to happen when I'm working on other games, often that are bigger. And I'm like, oh, I've had this weird mechanical idea, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because I also have those other priorities, those contracts, those like responsibilities to other people. So how can I make sure I don't overinvest myself into this thing? So forcing myself to a one page or bifold pamphlet or trifold pamphlet, it limits the number of words and the number of assets that I can put on the page. So at some point, the page is full and there's nothing I can do apart from essentially screaming at my computer because I can't rephrase something so that all the words that I want to put fit inside the page. Like this is one thing that I really like about them, is that like it allows me to test something relatively quickly without over investing myself in them. And I wanted to tackle another angle, but I forgot about it in the middle of it all. But yeah, that's kind of like one of the main point is, and they're fun. They're fun to experiment with because when you can try small things, and as I said, if you don't overinvest into it, you're not too attached to them as well. So if you spend, for example, 2 years working on this big game, and you have like, I don't know, 100-page book, a 200-page book, or 200-page PDF, whatever, you make a campaign or you release it on itch, and nobody cares.
Yeah.
Nobody downloads it because you didn't spend time maybe promoting it or like whatever. Like there are so many reasons that could make it so that people don't really look into your projects. But if you spend an evening, 2 days, a week working on a one-page RPG and you put it out there, if it works, it works. If it connects with people, it does. Otherwise, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think that is a great answer. Scope creep is, I doubt there's a single talk we've had on this channel that hasn't mentioned scope creep. If you have not experienced it yourself, there will come a time where your 3-month project passes a year of development, and you will see why we're always warning you about this sort of thing. But exactly, at a certain point, you have to have a limit. To start with is a great place because then you know, kind of like you said, the scope is unchangeable unless some miracle happens where you have to make a bigger game out of the idea. But even then, you've now been able to save a bunch of time with experimenting on 12 different ideas once a month rather than 1 year for one idea. Then, you know, if it just happens that the subject you picked for your one idea isn't very popular, even if you made incredible designs, you kind of wasted some time there if it's not just a personal project.
Right. And also, like, I've just remembered the thing I wanted to talk about, which is good. My brain is working. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if you're working on something big, like there's just so much rules that someone can digest and actually bring to their table. And if one thing that I like to do, if I'm working on a very big game, so at the moment, Dungeon Bound is my main project. It's like the big thing I'm working on. I already have like 80 pages like in the main document. It's going well. But at some point I was like, I think this is too much. I think that if I bring this to my table, people will forget about rules. I think there's just too much stuff. So what if I took it and made a one-page RPG out of it? I was able to boil it down to 3 pages, but that was a sign to me that it was still too much. So how could I remove even more things to try to condense it even more so that it's more digestible? And then from there, I can still expand on it. I can expand on rules in a way that don't necessarily add more cognitive load, and I can add more guidelines, but the core can still be 1 page.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It sounds like the 1 page, or at least the brief designs here, it's a very human friendly design element where we actually are taking into account how our brains work and how much information we can hold, and also how much commitment we have to a new thing. And being able to take a 1 pager and just say like, hey friends, take 15 minutes to read this and then let's play it tonight. It can't happen if it's even a handful of pages. Sometimes you're going to need at least someone who's experienced.
Yeah, like if you're reading Lasers and Feelings, you just like, you know it's 1 page, so you know you're not over investing yourself into something. Worst case scenario, you're going to spend 15 minutes learning that thing, and like that's enough. That's more than enough.
And more often than not, you will also, by the end of those 15 minutes, know if the game is for you or not, like whether it's your thing.
Yeah.
Because it's such a concentrated way that you've built something that you should be able to tell essentially what the experience will be like and whether you want that or not.
Yeah, there's no fluff. You get right to the point.
Exactly. Talking about, since I think this kind of goes into as well how you were saying earlier, so many people have made games and designs off of your games and designs. And I think this kind of bite-sized design is open and friendly to that. What elements or what other elements do you think are most successful or essential maybe for designing a one-page game?
Well, I think one thing that really helps is kind of finding your core. Like if you can find, and I mean the mechanical core, and by that I don't necessarily mean like the core mechanic. Like if you're talking about like the main sort of roles you're doing, whether you're rolling d20s or d6s, if it's a pull or if it's you're against a target number. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the not the game a bit of the gameplay loop, but essentially if your one page RPG could be an SRD, if it could be a system, what makes the system click or what makes the setting click? What's the core of the game? And I think trying to convey this in a very short format, like everybody has heard this, but like rules and restrictions help with creativity. So if you have only one page to try to find the core of a game, it helps you focus because you don't overexpand. If you look at Blades in the Dark, which is a fantastic game and a great SRD, it is a complex machine. Like there are a lot of things going on, a lot of gears that are going inside one another to make this whole machine work, and it works. But if you try to do this from like your first ideas, it's going to be very difficult. But if you're able to do it inside a one-page RPG, it helps a lot. Like for example, one of my most popular SRD is the Breathless SRD, which is based on Breathless, a zombie survival horror game, where the main mechanic that I don't even want to talk about how you resolve things, but the main mechanics is that you roll a die, and that die is associated with a skill. And the more you use that skill, every time you use it, that die will step down from one die size to the other. If you roll the d12, the first time will step down to a d10, then the next time to a d8. And the only time you can actually reset those die is by catching your breath. And when you do so, it introduces a new complication. It prompts the GM, it forces the GM to throw something into the face of the players. And to me, I didn't realize that this was the core of what Breathless was until I was kind of done. I was like, okay, I don't have any more words on that page. What makes this fun? What makes this click? And it was this. It wasn't the core mechanic. It wasn't the way I handled items. It was like this tension loop of rising tension and then release, which sways back into rising tension again. So I think that like this format helps you find that core. And this is, if once you have this, you can expand on it.
Yeah, and I think that's an awesome example too, because even the title Breathless, a one-word title for the one page, and you were talking about the mechanics, like the actual dice, which, is more like getting into the weeds a little bit. But as soon as you say, and the way you recover the dice is by catching your breath, and everything is contextualized immediately. Breathless, catching your breath, all the mechanical stuff you just mentioned becomes a narrative thing in your mind because you understood what that journey was mechanically.
Yeah, you find your mechanic loop essentially.
Speaking of the kind of finding these seamless ways to put mechanics into these small texts, can you share an example of a mechanic that was maybe challenging to fit in a one-page system, or something that you maybe had to rework in order to make it a one-page?
There are times where I've cheated. Like when I was working, I had made a game which I thought would be a one-page RPG, and it ended up being a two-page RPG that was Songs and Sagas. So it's like a kind of Vikings that are crossing a portal that brings them to a essentially scavenger reigns, like the TV show from HBO. Like it's kind of like an alien planet, but like the world was about to burn, so the Vikings kind of left and they've appeared on an alien planet. It was kind of like the pitch of the game, and there's a lot of like exploration mechanics. There's kind of like an X grid in there, and you navigate from one section to the other. Each segment of the map has different ratings, and those ratings can affect the game mechanically. And this ended up being too much to explain, even because also when you have a one-page RPG, one thing that I think is even more fun with one-page RPGs is if you're able to actually put the character sheet in there as well. But usually this takes a whole panel. Like if you have a bifold pamphlet, you have 4 panels. One of them will potentially be, or a section of them will be a character sheet, and that steals word real estate. So with the map and the character sheet and all the rules, and I also wanted like complex combat mechanics and all of that, eventually I just couldn't fit anymore. I was like, this needs to grow by one page, and I think this is worth it. And this is one time where I cheated, but what the game that I'm working on right now, Dungeon Bound, as I said, it was like a more complex game. And when I tried to boil it down to a one-page RPG, one thing that was tricky is what can you remove and still keep that core? What can you change and adapt and make it more accessible? Because one-page RPGs, the beautiful thing about them is that they are accessible. You can pick them up, we said it, you read them very quickly, and then you get to play them. The character sheet's already in there, you just create your character and you're good to go. So I had those very complex combat mechanics. I don't know if you've played games like Horizon Zero Dawn, where you have like bosses, and those bosses have different phases, and throughout those phases, like you're able to target certain parts of the monsters, of the beasts, and when you damage them, they kind of fall down, and then they're not able to use them and things like that. And I was like, this could be so fun inside a TTRPG. What if players could target enemy abilities? And what if those enemy abilities had HP? So the players say, I'm going to target this, and then the enemy's not able to use them. And once all the abilities are gone, then you move to the next phase, and then there are more dangerous abilities, each with their own HP. And this felt so fun, but also it's hard to visualize, and it takes a long time to explain, and I just didn't have the space. But I also needed this to be a one-page RPG. I needed to find my core. So I ended up simplifying the combat mechanics. And one thing that was very important to me is, how can I keep this kind of phased aspect while still making enemies and combat interesting, but also keep it simple? And that ended up being pretty challenging, because as I said, like the way that I envisioned combat for that game almost needed some sort of, you almost needed an example of what an enemy looks like side by side with the rules. And I think the main book will need to have this, but I don't have that luxury inside the one-page rule. So trying to boil down those things ended up being more complicated. I think I found a good way. I want to release that PDF soon into the world so that people can say whether I succeeded or not. But yeah, we'll see.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think you're touching on another benefit of this creative restriction, is that basically any time that a designer is making something, you are hoping to get down to what is the minimum amount of words and rules that I need to make this thing happen. And so kind of in the opposite direction, if you've made a one page and no matter what you're doing, it's not fitting within the one page, well, then maybe the minimum is 2 pages, and still within the realm of TTRPGs, that's a pretty small digestible game that you've kept yourself from, if your scope creep is going from 1 page to 2, then you're probably doing okay.
Yeah, it's pretty like it's good rules to like you cheat a little bit. You're like, okay, just 1 more page, but not more.
Awesome. I want to move to the kind of more practical layout suggestions, but one last thing about the design. Is there anything you can think of that are common pitfalls or kind of beginner mistakes for designing one-page RPGs, whether it's a new designer in general or someone trying to shift from the kind of more assumption of a big book going into a small design like this?
I feel like there are so many creatives out there, and they have so many great ideas for their worlds and their settings. And as soon as we start thinking about game mechanics, and not just random game mechanics, but game mechanics that I call rules bright, which in the way that I describe them is that they are rules that are designed to reinforce the setting, the themes of the game.
I love that.
So if you just like, for example, like if you make a game and it's like a slice of life game about, I don't know, bumblebees in a coffee shop that have to manage the drama of their daily lives, and you use a mechanic like D20 against target modifier with an armor class and whatever, it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
Right? It just won't work. But if you create game mechanics that work with themes, then it helps so much. But one thing that's I think problematic is that, yeah, we have all those great ideas. And then when we start thinking about creating good game mechanics that work with our themes, then we hit a wall. Then we're like, okay, we're going to need to talk about balance to some extent. Like balance in TTRPGs is a touchy subject, but I think that some minimal balance inside pacing balance is what I would describe it. Like how long does it take to trigger something is an important concept. And starting to think about this, like how often am I going to succeed? How often am I going to fail? How often is this condition going to go from false to true? Those things are tricky to get right. Like, for example, I'm a software engineer during the day, and when I create new systems, I write programs that will unit test all my rules and simulate playthroughs
Interesting.
for tens of thousands of times just so that I can get, like, I made a game that needed a ending. It just needed an ending. And I was like, how many sessions is that going to take? Assuming that there's this number of rolls and this number of times this rule is going to happen. I ran simulations. I was like, okay, I need to tweak the mechanics because it's happening too early or it's happening too late. So when there are a lot of great systems out there, but those systems, I think they work because the designer has either play tested or ran simulations like myself or both to find mechanics that have good pacing. And I think that one pitfall that designers, I assume, could fall into is trying to design something from scratch. It's fun, but it's challenging. And maybe it's too much of a challenge. And I would suggest starting from something and tweaking it. The first game that I've ever designed was a generic version of Blades in the Dark. I wanted to play the Blades in the Dark system, but in a sci-fi setting with my group. And I didn't want to play Scum and Villainy. I wanted my own thing. So I acted and made a generic version that would work in any setting. But I didn't create my own thing. I took this very complex beast and tweaked it in some direction, and it still worked. And this allows you to practice your design skills and game design skills, not layout skills. And from there, it's less intimidating, and you have something that has good pacing, and you can still tweak the mechanics. It's not just about like renaming. If we're talking about like Lasers and Feelings by John Harper, it's not just about renaming those two stats, but if you can add a little bit of you into it, it's still your game. But starting from there will fix any pacing issues that your game may have, and then you can concentrate on adding more you and then adding your setting and connecting everything. And from there, I think once you feel more comfortable, then you can start experimenting with creating your own systems, because it's a big challenge and it's complicated.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. There's a couple of things that I wanna touch on. I may have to slide out some of my layout questions because I think this is a really good topic. One, I want to say like what you're saying is so true of I think most people who actually stick with game design in some regard is you don't just wholesale scratch make something that's never been done in any way. You don't go, I'm not going to use a single set of dice that another game uses. Like sometimes it's just a matter of even forgetting a rule and going, actually, I liked it this way. I'm going to keep it this way. And then maybe you change another. And over time, a lot of one pages, from what I can tell, were kind of more complicated games that someone said, I wish this was simpler and more streamlined. And, you don't go to school and without ever having been given a book, say, all right, now start writing. You look at stuff that exists first, because how could you just invent all of these things yourself?
Yeah.
I wanted to get into the playtesting that you mentioned. Playtesting is obviously, I think in the last couple of years, got more and more notoriety as something you really need to do and that can really help you out. But one-page testing, clearly you already mentioned using your software background to simulate testing. What are some other ways that playtesting in one-pagers might be different?
Obviously, if you have a one pager, you have less things to test, right? Like, especially if that one pager includes a setting and a character sheet and all of that, you probably don't have that many rules. So I think that like the main thing that you need to test is the pacing of your mechanics. If you have essentially conditions and triggers, this is what you need to test. Like, you need to test how often something is going to happen, and then you need to decide, is it happening too frequently or not frequently enough? And then you tweak. So in terms of like testing things, obviously if you make a game that's solo friendly, you can test it yourself. That's the beauty of it, right? Or you just steal some oracles from another system and you play your game yourself anyway. It doesn't matter, right? But testing those things yourself will help. But I think that one thing that's problematic is the amount of data that you're going to get. Like, let's assume that you test it yourself and you play it. Let's assume a generous number. Let's say you play your game solo 30 times. It's a lot of time, but it's still only 30. And the chances are the odds will be extremely biased because it's not a large enough data set. And even if you play your games with your friends every week for a year, it's still just 52 game sessions. So if you want to test the balance of things, like that's why games that already, like systems that are already very popular right now, those things have already been battle tested by hundreds of groups for hundreds of hours, and they've been tweaked. And like if you look at the way that Evil Hat does it, when they announced Deathmatch Island, one of their latest Paragon game, they were like, okay, we're inviting playtesters to come in, and then they had like playtesting sessions for weeks with hundreds of people, and this helped clarify the game. So I think that like one way to do it, you can do it yourself, you can do it with your group, and that's better than nothing. Don't assume that like your game is going to be bad because you don't test it enough. Like I think that playtesting is important, but I do truly think that it's overrated. Like if you're able to find general good pacing within your system, there are so many rules that once they hit the table, people kind of just push them away. They forget about them. They essentially just use that mechanic, and the rest is just vibes. So yes, playtesting is important. I've found many issues with my games by playtesting them myself, by sending it to designer friends who've playtested them for me. But I would say if you're designing your own system from scratch and you're not taking an existing system reference document, I would say using a website like AnyDice is an interesting approach because you can kind of test your core mechanics relatively easily. You need to learn a bit of the syntax of how that website works, but essentially you can use their scripting language to simulate certain kind of things, and there are like forums online on how to learn this specific syntax, but it gives you odds and ends because it runs those tests for thousands and thousands of times to be able to find the percentages of how often something will happen or will not happen. But for example, in the case of Breathless, I didn't run simulations for that game because that game is itself based on someone else's work. It like one of the core piece of Breathless, like the way that dice trigger successes and failures, is based on the 24XX system from the 2400 game by Jason Tochi. So I think finding good inspiration and adapting it, giving credit, and going from there is going to be way easier, except if you're a software engineer, than to try to make your own simulations of your games.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. If you're using someone's work that has already been tested, then there's a limit to how much you need to test it as long as you're not really reworking it.
You need to test the delta. You need to test what you changed, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you need to see, and now you have a control, which is even better, because you know how it normally works with all the testing of the game already existing, and then you look at just what you change. So that's super efficient, which is really helpful, and fits along with the core of one page. We will move on, but I also wanted to just mention, I thought it was really interesting. Very, very rarely do I see people talking about balance as a pacing issue. Like you said, how long until something triggers, how often you will succeed, how often you'll fail, which, you know, if you're not in a game that has a competitive aspect, even if it's player versus, you know, enemy, being able to balance just how often is each player getting to do something fun is balance, even if it's not a like competitive balance. So I thought that was a very good call out and something that people should lock in there.
Yeah, and I think the first time it clicked for me was for clocks. If you think about clocks in Blades in the Dark or tracks, like this is essentially like when you determine like how much effect is going to go into a roll, 1, 2, or 3, and you have a clock that can go from 4, 6, or 8 segments. That was a decision to simulate pacing. Like it's not just like well, I think a clock with 20 segments would be hard to draw probably at the table.
Right.
But yeah, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're all good. You're all good. This is super interesting stuff. It's always hard to get it all out and stay within our time limit, but that is what you want. Cool. So let's move on to some practical kind of layout visual design considerations. I guess one thing that might be an impactful piece of advice to get your thoughts on, how do you decide what information gets the most visual prominence in a one-page game?
Yeah, I would say, and this is me, this is just me, but usually I think that even one page for an entire setting is often not enough, right? So if you have like, often in TTRPGs, you're going to have like all chapters dedicated to what the setting is and the cities and the locations, right? So if you take a look at the Wild Sea by Mythworks, like there's a whole chapter about like what the world is about, and then near the end, like there are tons of different islands and descriptions about like the different like heritage of the people of that world, and trying to condense this in a single page, it just wouldn't be worth it. So I think that like with one page RPGs, I think that your setting needs to turn into tables because you save a lot of space and you allow for a lot of options, and you can convey your settings through your table without having to necessarily say it. So let's say that I'll go back to Breathless for a second. In Breathless, there's a table for the kind of professions that the characters can be, because you are people trying to survive a zombie apocalypse. So like, who were you? And the professions can go from a science teacher or a DJ or like an influencer or like someone who worked in a police department. But like there is no one that's military, for example. So it's like, well, like that's the designer trying to convey something that the characters cannot be military, and they're generally normal people trying to survive the apocalypse, right? So using tables to convey your setting and convey like the important things, the important like themes of your game is such a space efficient way of handling this. So I think that like usually what I do, I always try to make my games accessible. So I'm always going to try to keep a section about introducing how to play the game. What is an RPG and what you're actually supposed to do. Even if it's 2 or 3 sentences, usually I'm going to try to keep a bit of space for this. A huge part of my one-pagers are usually my character sheets, because I think they need to be big, because you're going to be referencing them a lot. Like that's probably the thing that players will interact with the most. So they need to be clear and big and accessible. And the rest is probably a split 50-50 between the game's rules and tables, and maybe a bit of text to say like, this is essentially a game about this. You're playing those kinds of people who have to face those sorts of challenges. So this is essentially how I'm trying to split those things. Obviously, the ratios can kind of shift one way or another. Like in Songs and Sagas, it's mostly like probably over 60 or 70% game rules. So it's a more chunky game than like the others, but still.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what you mentioned about the tables is such a sleek way of getting across something about your world, where, like you were saying, if half of the choices for a career option in a game are military, then you're leaning into something that's more like Call of Duty Zombies-esque, versus if it's cheerleaders and lifeguards and stuff, then you're like, oh, this is like an 80s horror movie. And those are two very different things, but they are both explicitly zombies. And that can go for anything. I've seen games that are about like illegal street racing. And if they had a table where you're rolling, what are the 3 parts of your car that they're most tuned up, and it's super specific about car parts. That's very different than rolling for what is the sticker that you have on your hood, and it's a bunch of funny kind of memey stickers you're putting in. Those are 2 very different games and very different worlds. But all you've done is put a little table. You've not mentioned anything about the world.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really good takeaway.
Yeah, especially if you connect those tables to segments of your character sheet. Like if during character creation you refer to those tables, then players will get a feel of the game very, very quickly without you having to do anything.
Exactly. Yeah, if just through a couple of dice rolls you can create a character that then tells you, well, this character could only live in this type of world, then you know the world all of a sudden, which is really cool. Are there any other either graphic design or just kind of like visual principles or tricks that you use? Anything that's kind of been a little shortcut to getting things onto the one page, anything like that?
In the past, when I was getting started, one of the first thing that like I didn't know how to use like graphic, like as I said, I've got a background in software engineering, so I'm no graphic designer. I'm a front end software engineer, so I know when something looks pretty, but I'm not a designer, so I don't necessarily know. At least in the past, I didn't necessarily know how to make it pretty.
Right. You can say, I don't like that yet, but not what I want it to do.
Exactly. I know what is pretty, and that isn't.
Yeah.
I don't know how to fix it. Now I do, but one thing that has helped me a lot in the past was using softwares like Canva. It's a web application, and in there are many, many templates for one pagers, for trifolds and bifold pamphlets, or even just a one page, like just a normal piece of paper essentially. And then there's a lot of free assets that you can just drag and drop. There's many free fonts that are available, and then you select a heading font, a body font, and you're relatively good to go. And in the past, this is how I was doing things because it allowed me to work quickly. And one of the problem with creation in general is friction. And not just that, with any effort. Like I'm trying to get in shape and to try to do more exercise, and to try to help me with this, I've tried to reduce friction. Every single thing that can help me get on my bike and do a run every single morning, like a ride every single morning for 30 minutes, anything that can reduce the friction of me standing up and going to my bike will help. And it's the same thing for creative process because it's a challenge that you need to overcome. So if finding assets, if finding good fonts is hard, if finding good rules that are balanced is hard, you need to find ways to help you with this and to reduce this friction, because you need to take the words that you have inside your head and put them into this virtual piece of paper. And this takes time and work. So yeah, reducing friction. So using applications like this that give you an easy way to not think too much about layouts. Like when you use apps like this, they often come with predefined margins. So you don't need to worry about this. You don't need to worry about bleed settings. And like, am I using like RGB colors or CMYK? Does this matter for me? It's like when you spin up a software like Affinity Publisher, or I think it's InDesign for Adobe, something like that.
Yeah.
Like they require a bit more work and a bit more knowledge. And when I got started, I started from there because it allowed me to reduce friction. And then eventually from there, I finished games. And then I learned, made other games, finished them, and learned, added more tools to my tool belt, eventually made the switch to bigger and more powerful software for designing. And now I'm using Affinity Publisher exclusively. And I think that like starting from something that gives you a lot of free assets and free fonts and predefined good settings is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like in general, we have the tendency as creators to see things that were made by teams and think, I want all those things that this team made. And so all of a sudden you have to be the graphic designer, the layout editor, the art, everything. And there are tools that can just let you shortcut those things sometimes. And, if a game absolutely needs more art, if you make the game and it's good, you can add the art later, but you shouldn't be holding yourself up from designing by saying, well, I don't have the right title font yet.
Yeah.
Because that is a simple change on a menu, but making the game right is not. That's something that you actually have to do. So
yeah, you don't need to do anything all by yourself. You can build off what others have done. Like for example, at some point I wanted to make a page in a game where the spread looked like an old retro computer with like actual scan lines going from the top to the bottom and fading, and like I wanted a warp effect so that the text would kind of mimic the old screens that weren't flat.
Yeah.
So I did that from scratch, but 2 or 3 years ago I would have dropped an image that already had all of this baked in. So
Exactly. You don't have to do everything yourself. There's no one's going to be able to tell this guy made the scan line, so the game's better.
no, it was a personal challenge for me.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Let's go ahead and move into the kind of advice for designers and get to some questions that have been submitted. So we'll start with the kind of softball obvious question. Is there any advice that you would give to people wanting to make their first one-page RPG?
This one, and I promise this is not a segue into me trying to sway you into joining my game jam, but game jams. I think game jams are such, because I've given a lot of tips so far, and I think that like if you follow all of those, you can get a one-page RPG pretty quickly. Like if you just think about your setting, think about like two movies or two books that you love, merge them together, use the tips that I've given so far, and you're pretty much good to go. But then there's something that's missing. It's a deadline. When you have a clock that's ticking. Usually, like, I think that clocks that are tied to actual human beings help better. Like, if someone has specifically asked you to do something and they require it, like if for example, if you got paid to do a task, usually it's a good incentive that like you need to finish this by this date. But the next best thing, I think, is a game jam, because a jam, usually people that organize them, they're gonna define the scope, the themes. They will include many resources about like system reference documents that you can use, and then they'll include also links to font websites, free assets websites that you can use as well. They will probably give you templates for Canvas, Google Docs, Affinity Publisher, InDesign, and then you can just kind of download all of it and get started. And then you have a deadline. You have a month, 2 months, a week, 24 hours, and you have to do it. You click the join button. You have to finish this thing, because the two advice that I would give is joining a jam helps, but finishing something is more important. Because if you don't finish it, and that's the beauty of one-page RPGs, is that the challenge is not a mountain, it's a hill. So you can start it and then finish it. It won't be perfect, but it doesn't matter. Because from there, you got more accustomed to using this random website for downloading your images, and this cool effect that you found on Canva, and like this formatting, like this cool font that you found on this random web. Like you got familiar with all those things, and you'll learn from it. And the next game that you're going to be doing is going to be easier and easier. And then instead of changing one or two things off an SRD, then maybe you're going to change 5 things, 10 things, add more things to them. And then eventually maybe you're going to create your own system, and you're going to be feeling comfortable doing so. So yeah, that would be the two things that I would recommend.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And what is the name of your jam, by the way?
It is the Breathless Jam, second edition. So there are like 250 Breathless games out there, and we made the jam when I released the initial game like 2 years ago, 2 or 3, and yeah, like since then there's been 250 games, and now we decided like we're gonna redo a new edition of Breathless, and with a pretty important name in the industry, which I shall not divulge just now, but it'll be big. And yeah, we're gonna make a new edition of the game, and to celebrate this, we decided to organize a second edition of the jam. And yeah, there's already 120 participants as of today, and everything that I just said, I did. Like there are links to, even if you don't join the jams, just open the jam page and look for all the links for downloading free resources, free templates, and like then you can use this and create your own things from there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, clearly game jams are 99% of the time, it's just one or two people who love games so much that they're trying to make it as easy as possible for you to try to make games too. And I absolutely second that. I think most people who succeed, or at least find a comfortable way to work in this environment, are usually people who have figured out the structure that they need. So the structure of, I can only write on one page, it can't go past to the second page, and I can only write until this date in a week. That's such a clearly defined thing. And like you said, the kind of the two outcomes you can get are you finish on time, maybe you did better than you expected, or you're just proud to have something done that you can look at, or you almost finish and then you can just spend another day or two working on it anyways, and that's still just as good because you still finish something. So there's really no losing in a game jam.
No, because you're learning.
Exactly. And like you said, even if you do nothing, you can grab a bunch of really helpful resources. You can look at what other people are doing to get inspired. So yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice.
And then we get more games. This is cool. Like we get more games that we can play, so that's fun.
Exactly. We're all helping each other out with it. Let's get into, let me see if there are any submission questions real quick. Okay, Zondro early asked, do you think one-page games can lend themselves well to long-form gameplay, or do the requirements of brevity mean the mechanics will primarily reinforce a shorter duration?
I think it depends on how the game is formatted. Like, if you take a look at, let's go back to Lasers and Feelings for a second, or even Honey Heist for that matter. The core of the game is essentially one mechanic, maybe two, and the rest is rolling tables. So obviously a game like this, it will be harder to play this for an extended period of time, not because it's impossible, but because you essentially have like a, a mixing board with tons of little buttons that you can press and knobs that you can turn. And if you have one big mixing board and that thing has only one button that you can press, you're like, oh, it's fun. It makes some like lights and some sounds, and like it has a nice little clicking effect. I love this button. And then you're like, after 10 minutes, you're okay, yeah, it was a nice button, but I won't do this for 24 hours. So it's kind of like the same thing. So if a one-page RPG is mostly focused on setting, vibe, rolling tables, and doesn't have a lot of mechanics, then it will be harder to play this game for extended periods of time, mostly because at some point you may expect a bit more from the game, more procedures, more mechanics, more, I don't like the word crunch, it's not crunch, but just more buttons that you can press essentially. But there are games, one-page games, that will include more buttons and more knobs, and they may still include a couple of rolling tables, but it's a gradient essentially. So if there are more knobs that you can press, more buttons you can push, then the game will lend itself to more game sessions, I think. So I had made a solo exploration game called Firelights, and it is a trifold pamphlet, but I've seen actual plays on YouTube of people playing this game for 8-9 sessions, like while recording themselves, and it was a beautiful story.
Wow.
And I think it worked because the game has a lot of procedures and lends itself to yeah, it just has more things that you can interact with. And also, like, if you interact with 2 or 3 buttons for the first session, but then you play the second session and the story goes into a direction that prompts you to use different buttons, then there's a sentiment of excitement. You get excited because you have new things that you can play with. So yeah, it's kind of like it really depends on how you format the game, I think.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Just brought up, I think we kind of already answered this because you have your game jam going on. Just asked if you were going to suggest one of your SRDs for a new creator to use, what would you choose?
Yeah, I think Breathless works. I think the Breathless SRD definitely works because, like, especially for more traditional group play, like if you're used to playing things like D&D or and the like, I think Breathless lends itself more to that sort of gameplay loop. But and it has a couple of knobs that you can adjust, which I think are fun. And obviously we have the jab going on, so I think it's a great opportunity. But I think that one of my SRDs that is the most approachable would be Firelights. It would be that solo exploration game, mostly because like it's not that much math. It's mostly procedures and mechanics that are connected to one another. So there's a list of actions that are player facing, and it's a solo game. So essentially, when the players are playing the game, they look at the list of options of things that they can do, literally buttons that they can push. And they're like, oh, like I'm kind of bored. I'm not sure where I need to go in the story. They look at the game, and every single header inside that game is something that they can do mechanically. And those headers, all those little buttons, they connect to one another. So like you roll to make, let's say you face like a dangerous creature, and you attack it. When you fail to attack, they get an opportunity to attack you, which triggers another one of the actions, which is like an evade actions and things like that. So like I think Firelight is probably the most approachable SRD that I have because it's solo friendly. So also you can test it yourself. So that helps a lot.
Perfect. And that kind of hits both sides of the spectrum. If you want to join a big community game jam where a bunch of people are working together and trying stuff out, the game jam's running. If you want to check that out, I believe Jess linked it in the chat. Or if you want to plug away by yourself, then we've got this solo game that you can test yourself and run through and work on. So both great options. If any of you are interested in trying out one-page game designs, I would recommend take the opportunity now. Just go check one of those two out. RP, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else that you want to say before we do our final shout outs and get out of here?
I would just say I saw that Jess sent a link to Keeper. So Keeper is a website that I maintain, which includes over 50 different open licensed resources, games, SRDs, and things like that. So if you want to browse for cool systems and cool games, go there. There's the Fate system, Blades in the Dark, Resistance, 24XX. There's just a lot of stuff going on that website. So it's all accessible. You can read it on your mobile phone if you want. So like, yeah, like I think that would be one of my shout outs. Like that website is a treasure trove of absolute good content from many brilliant designers.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I think that just about sums up one of the big themes here. RP has collected just a huge trove of resources. Anywhere that you click on any of your links seems like it's going to basically set you up for success. So check that out. RP, any other social medias, anything you want to plug?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Fari RPGs, Fari RPGs, or my handle is RPDESHAIES, but essentially if you find Fari, you're going to find me. And yeah, I'm mostly active on Blue Sky. I also record a bunch of videos on the Fari RPGs YouTube channels, which are mostly tutorials on how to make TTRPGs and how to use Affinity Publisher. So I highly recommend you check it out. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for hopping on here with us and sharing your knowledge. And thank you for your commitment to open games. That's something that is so important to keeping games alive in general. So anytime we see someone doing work there, we always really appreciate it. We are done here today, folks. I have been Clay Powell, and this has been another wonderful RT Talk. You can check out, I believe all of our social medias should be Rising Tide or TTRPG Rising Tide. We will have another RT Talk soon, I'm sure. And that is pretty much it for us. So remember, friends, a rising tide lifts all boats, and we will see you sometime soon.